always when we read the Bible, we have the challenge of trying to interpret it. It's written in a different culture, and so sometimes the things that it seems to say on the surface really jar with us, and sometimes the things, actually, when you dig into it, it is what it seems to say on the surface. Other times, that's not always the case. And with this first part of 1 Peter chapter 3, I imagine if you're anything like me, you read it and you thought, gosh, I'm not sure about some of this. How do we understand it? First of all, we have to read it in the light of the rest of the New Testament and the rest of the scriptures. In the New Testament, there's other places where marriage is talked about. One of those is Ephesians chapter 5. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul talks about mutual submission that all believers are to have with one another, which would include the submission of a husband to a wife. And then he goes on and he says, yes, wives are to submit to their husbands, but he also talks about how husbands are to love their wives in the way that Christ loves the church and gives himself up for her. In other words, husbands, get ready to die for your wives when you get married. And so that's what all of us should bring into any sort of marriage. So we prefer one another. We die for and to the other. We lay down our lives that the other person might flourish. Here, specifically, Peter is addressing the issue of women who are married to unbelieving husbands. And what he's really driving at is that they are to behave in a way in that culture that would have made them a standout wife. So that the husbands would look at their wives, they think, gosh, you're amazing, why is that? And at that point, the wife would be able to point them to Jesus. In verse 7, Paul talks about how both husbands and wives are heirs. He uses that phrase of both of them. And what that tells us is that Peter is saying that there's a spiritual equality between husbands and wives, that both inherit all the riches of Christ. The main thrust, though, is that we're to behave in a way that would lead the unbeliever into a relationship with Jesus. And that ties in with what Peter's saying elsewhere, not least what he comes to in verse 15, where he says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have in Jesus. And sometimes we can think we need to know all the answers to all the tough questions. And it's helpful to know the answers. It's important that we understand what it is that we believe. But a really great starting place can be to tell someone our story. That's one of the most powerful tools any of us have, to say openly and honestly, this is why I'm a Christian, because I understood the message of Jesus when someone said it to me this one time, and I gave my life to him, and since then I've found that my life's been totally different. To try and do it in normal language, not Christianese, and then when we do that, to be open and honest about the stuff that we still perhaps don't understand. We don't have to have all the answers. We do have to be real, and we do have to be ready.